This summer at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, after a years-long discernment process starting in 2020, a vote of more than 80% of delegates in favor, including many from this congregation, we changed our previous UU principles and sources to our new UU values and covenant, symbolized by this flower graphic. Many theologically conservative religious movements are proud of never updating their beliefs, no change ever, despite thousands of years passing and many new insights coming to light. In contrast, we UUs are a theologically liberal religious tradition. We call ourselves a living tradition. We've always been committed to growing and changing and evolving in light of new insights, new evidence, perspectives, and experiences. Appropriately, our symbol is not something solid, but the living, glowing, warm fire of the chalice flame. Indeed, the bylaws of our Unitarian Universalist Association require us every 15 years to re-examine Article 2 to see if it needs an update for our changing times. Article 2 of our bylaws this is really policy wonky, I realize. It's where the principles and sources were found and where our values and covenant are now found. To write these new values and covenant, input was collected from thousands of UUs around the country, including many opportunities in which members of this congregation voiced our opinions. One related point that may be reassuring to some of you is that the heart of the principles are still there. It's a little complicated to fully trace. You can kind of do this at length if you want to on your own. But in short, you'll find our previous first principle embedded in the new equity value. The second principle is distributed among a few different values. The third is in the value of transformation, the fourth principle under pluralism, the fifth under justice, and that final freedom of belief clause. You'll see that on the back of your order of service. The sixth under justice as well. The seventh principle is the new interdependence value, and the eighth principle is the justice value, and a few other places as well. So there's one other important angle to consider from the perspective of history. On the one hand, our UU principles have been with us for a long time. The original version was written more than 6 decades ago in 1960, when the Universalist Church in America and the American Unitarian Association were consolidating into the American Unitarian Association we know today. On the other hand, the principles have actually been updated a number of times over the years to keep up with changing times, to be less sexist, for example. And the history of Unitarian and Universalism goes back for centuries, long before we had principles. If we had more time, we could consider some of the historical covenants that preceded our UU principles, such as a fascinating document passed in 1887. You can Google this if you want to read it. It's titled, "Things Most Commonly Believed Among Us Today." That's essentially what this new values statement is that you find on the back of your order of service. Not some new creedal test of what you have to believe as UUs. As we often say, we believe in deeds, not creeds, and that you don't have to believe alike to love alike. It's more like things most valued among us today. As our Unitarian and Universalist forebears have done in the past with previous covenants, at least for the next 15 years or so, we're invited to seek wisdom from these values, to take them for a test drive. And I, for one, am a fan of this jet pig mascot that Layla shared with you during the story. Here's a few. Layla's an artist, and they can really draw. I used AI. This one's pretty cute. I like the love at the center, right, of this one. And this is Jet Pig in Florida. Yeah. All right. Steampunk Jet Pig, also with heart at the center. You see the UU t-shirt on this one. And then also loves on the rocket there with another. And I do think Jet Pig's a good way to remember these. So in the minute of silence to follow, I invite you to turn to that back page of your order of service and notice what parts of this new UU values and covenant resonate with you most. I invite you to just loosen around anything that's like not your jam and just notice, like, what do you appreciate? What do you like most about these new values and covenant? How might they serve you in this season of your life or in this season of our life together? I don't do a lot of sermon series. I mean, I guess there are some that I do once a year that we've been revisiting, but I think this switch from our UU principles and sources to our new UU values and covenant, this is a really significant paradigm shift. So this Sunday is part 1 of a 9-part sermon series. So I'm gonna revisit this once a month. We're gonna take the different parts of it in turn. And I'm calling it Living Our UU Values and Covenant. We will, again, revisit it once a month this congregational year. We'll finish in early June to learn more about these new UU's values and covenant that we adopted this summer at UU General Assembly, which, by the way, I should pause to mention, who knows where General Assembly is this summer in late June? Where is it? Baltimore. So save the date. You can Google UU General Assembly. I'll send out an email in a little bit, but it is truly worth your time. It is I think there are at least two things that are really transformative about going to GA for the first time. One is being in a room with like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 other UUs. It's a really interesting experience. And then the second thing is there's always an exhibition hall. And so basically all the UU groups from all around the country are there with their wares and their propaganda. And you get, it really gives you a sense of like all the things going on. It's a great crash course, and there are amazing workshops and great. So really, if you can't, and it'll start Wednesday night and end Sunday morning. So even if you can just get, Thursday or Friday or Saturday, if you can even get out there for one day, great. But if you actually can block off and like get a hotel room in downtown Baltimore, it's really worth doing, especially with it so close. So think about that this summer. So let's start by exploring our We'll start by exploring our 6 UU values with love at the center, and toward the end, we will explore our new inspirations and the inclusion and freedom of belief statements. So again, you can see these on the back of your order of service for details. The only part missing is the inclusion paragraph. I realize it's ironic that we excluded inclusion. It's not because it's unimportant. There's just only so much room on one sheet without seriously overcrowding. So if you can actually we're not trying to hide this from you. If you want to go to frederickuu.org/values, you too can read the inclusion statement, or we will revisit it later in the year. For now, as we reflect on our UU values and covenant, I think one main virtue of this flower graphic is that it is in many ways non-hierarchical. In the past, our values were numbered, 1 through 7, and then we added an 8th, which could give the arguably accurate impression that our first principle of the inherent worth and dignity of every person has historically been more important than our 7th principle of respect for the interdependent web of all existence. Indeed, our first principle, affirming the worth of every independent individual, was passed in 1960, just prior to the merger of Unitarianism and Universalism. But it was not until 1985, 2.5 decades later, that we realized we needed to add a 7th principle, not of independence, but of interdependence. With the addition of our 7th principle, we finally realized that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was right on when he said that in a real sense, all of life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. Similarly, the South African worldview of Ubuntu describes this worldview as I am because we are. Or from a Buddhist perspective, Thich Nhat Hanh used to describe this worldview as interbeing, the call to realize that we humans are. The challenge is not merely to grasp this insight intellectually, but to truly grok it at an existential level. Along these lines, in 1988, a few years after we added our 7th principle in 85, the renowned sociologist of religion, Robert Bellah, delivered a lecture at UU General Assembly. Go to General Assembly. You get to hear from folks like Robert Bellah, who are world-renowned. It was titled Unitarian Universalism in Social Perspective. in which he honed in on the significance of this change, of us adding a seventh principle. He said that what your UU's seventh principle of interdependence is on the verge of asking, I am forthrightly asking. Give up ontological individualism and affirm that human nature is fundamentally social. Now, ontology is just a fancy word for the philosophical study of being. Bella is challenging us to stop thinking of ourselves first as separate individuals and instead wake up to the truth that both spirituality and quantum physics point to, that reality is fundamentally social and interdependent. Bella continues, affirming that human nature is fundamentally social would mean making that interdependent web of all existence the first of your seven principles and not the last. And if you truly believe in a free and responsible search for truth, the truth is that nature is social. I bring all that up to highlight that although our new UU values are intentionally depicted as a non-hierarchical circle, I actually think they intentionally put interdependence on top, whether they would tell you that or not. And maybe they would explicitly tell you that, to invite us to experiment with a movement with a greater focus on the interdependent nature of reality. As many of you have heard me say before, one of the most significant insights that I have gained from years of practicing meditation is that reality is process and relationship all the way down. Everything's a verb. There are no nouns. With that worldview in mind, let's look at the language of our UU values of interdependence, and as we do so, you'll notice that each of these values begins with a descriptive sentence and is followed by a covenant about what it means to live out that value together in community. For interdependence, our value states that we honor the interdependent web of all existence with reverence for the great web of life, and that web image I think is really helpful, right? Because you jingle in one part of the web and the whole thing shakes. We acknowledge our place in it. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustainable relationships of care and respect, mutuality and justice. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. In general, I agree with all that. The only change I would invite us to consider is that the true nature of reality is actually even deeper and even more intimate than interdependence. At the risk of being pedantic, we're actually interdependent. To explain, I want to stick with me because I'm actually going to get even nerdier. But this is really important. Einstein's theory of relativity has been with us for more than a century. But we have not integrated the full meaning of his discoveries into how we live our daily lives. If we had, it would not have taken us until 1985 to add interdependence as our seventh principle. And Robert Bella would never have had to challenge us to give up ontological individualism and affirm that human nature is fundamentally social. It is incredibly significant that after Einstein's theory of relativity, physicists stopped writing space and time separately and started writing them as space-time, one connected word. To say more, I want to share with you an insight from a fascinating and important book titled Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning by the particle physicist Karen Barad. Now, a lot of the times, the books that I share with you in my sermons, I recommend as excellent and accessible. This book is excellent, but be forewarned, it's fairly challenging, so just a heads up. But it is really important. And I want to highlight just one pivotal quote that relates to what I said about reality being process and relationship all the way down. Or for my grammar nerds, again, reality is much more like a verb than a noun. Here's the quote from Barad. Time, it turns out, is not a succession of evenly spaced individual moments. And space is not a collection of pre-existing points set out a container, as it were, for matter to inhabit. Rather, spatiality is intraactively produced. This is wild, trippy stuff. But let me give you one point of reference. Remember Einstein's twin paradox, that if you take two identical twins and you leave one on Earth and you send one in a spaceship, especially going close to the speed of light, that twin in space will age at a slower rate than the twin who remains on Earth. That's wild, but it's true. And a prime example of what we're talking about when we say time is not a succession of individually spaced out individual moments. Space is not a collection of pre-existing points. Space-time is interactively produced. Let me say a little bit more about what difference that makes. To switch from interdependent, between, to the prefix intra, within. Think about the difference between, this will make more sense to some of you who played sports in college, but the difference between intramurals, I-N-T-E-R, a contest between teams from two rival schools who come to one school or the other to play, and intramurals, which are teams formed within the same school. Neither we humans, reality is much more like intramurals with an A. Neither we humans nor space and time relate interactively, as if we were separate things that sometimes come together. Reality, very much including all of us, are always already interactive. Reality is process and relationship all the way down. We're all caught in this web. We are not, nor have we ever been, separate beings. We are intra-related becomings, deeply entangled down to the quantum level. We are neither separate observers of the world nor independent egos. We are inextricably part of that nature that we seek to understand. If you're looking for a more accessible point of entry than Barad's book, I recommend one recently published option, Intraconnected, MWE, M plus we, as the integration of self, identity, and belonging by Daniel Siegel, who is now who is a graduate of Harvard University Medical School and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA, and perhaps unsurprisingly, raised as a combination of Quaker and Unitarian Universalist. From a neuroscientific perspective, he affirms that both modern culture and the wiring of our brains, it tends to reinforce a way of living and a belief system based that our fundamental nature is independent, of separation, a life lived as a solo, isolated self. Yet a wider perspective revealed in contemporary science and echoed in generations of wisdom from indigenous and contemplative traditions unveils that our deeper reality is intra-dependent. As Einstein himself famously wrote in the New York Times in 1960, a human being is part of the whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. An optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for just a few people closest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison into widening, and by widening our circles of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Nobody is able to achieve this completely, but the striving for such an achievement is itself a part of the liberation and a foundation of our inner security. Siegel attempts to signify this insight by coining the term MWE. I don't know if that's going to catch on or not, but I see what he's getting to. To him, with this intra-connection, we do not lose our individuality. MWE embraces both the me and the we aspects of our identity. Ram Dass used to say it this way: you have to remember your Buddha nature and you have to remember your zip code. It's about both. MWE reminds us how we can integrate our identity and broaden our belonging to stretch beyond a limiting, separate solo self. To say more about recent neuroscientific discoveries, the default mode network is the term for so default mode. What do you do? What does your brain do when you're not doing anything else? It goes into default mode. And the default mode network lights up when nothing much else is going on. And I love that the term for what our brains what it results in is selfing. We self, that's kind of our default mode. Our brains construct this false sense of a separate ego or self. But here's the thing. When we enter into a flow state while participating in activities that's particularly absorbing, we stop selfing. The brain's default mode goes offline and our sense of self drops away, as does any sense of separation from the world. Some of you may have experienced this happening when you're just really caught up in something like playing a sport. For others of you, perhaps you've experienced it while gardening, creating art, reading, playing a musical instrument, being immersed in a crowd at a concert. And you usually realize in retrospect, right? You realize, whoa, it's like your sense of self comes back online, and you realize, whoa, I've just been really in the moment. I've been really in the flow, really connected. Notice that word absorbing, that when one's sense of self loosens into a flow state, we have a sense of just playing, just creating, just doing, just being, just becoming, at one with the world around us. Spiritual practices like meditation can make a more long-term shift in which one's baseline becomes much less a sense of separate ego and much more a sense of connection with the world. Some people have gotten also profound short-term glimpses of how truly intradependent reality is through substances like psychedelics. On the left is an example of normal brain activity. On the right is an example of communication between parts of our brain and people on psilocybin, in which their brain's default mode network is radically, if only temporarily, offline. We are not, nor have we ever been, separate beings. We are intra-related becomings, deeply entangled, down to the quantum level, deeply a part of the web of life. Siegel recommends the acronym coherence to remember and describe this synergistic, integrated state of MOE, of what our UU values call the interdependent web of all existence. We feel connected and open and harmonious and emergent and resonant and engaged and noetic, that's a nerdy word, compassionate and empathetic. Noetic is that sense of knowing as a conceptual wholeness, things making sense, fitting together, being consilient, having common ground across ways of knowing. More poetically, the poet John O'Donohue said it this way: I would love to live like the river flows, carried by the surprise of its own unfolding. But that's actually how we all really do live. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who helped bring Tibetan Buddhism to the West, used to say, the bad news is that we're all in free fall and we don't have a parachute. The good news is there is no ground. It's all flow, process, and relationship all the way down. For now, as we seek to live out our UU values of interdependence, I'll leave you with this quote from the conclusion of Karen Barad's Meeting the Universe Halfway. Meeting each moment, being alive to the possibilities of becoming, it is an ethical call, an invitation that is written into the very matter of all being and becoming. We need to meet the universe halfway, to take responsibility for the role that we play in the world's becoming, for the part we play in contributing to that web of all existence. I love the arc that the choir's anthem about the Waylon Jennings took us on, from this is the sound of one voice to voices two to voices three to this is the sound of all of us, as many of you have heard me say before, and I'll say it again so you keep hearing it. Some of these things we need to have so we hold on to it, that if you're feeling overwhelmed as one person in light of this coming election or climate justice or any of the other systemic problems, stop being one person. Right? Join together so you can be one voice. We're stronger together. And along those lines, if you are able to stay, please do stay right back here at noon. There's some food afterwards, and there'll be some food after the event. Stay if you can for our UU the Vote. And also, normally it's fine to linger in the sanctuary, but we actually need you, stay seated for the postlude, but then we actually need you to clear the sanctuary so we can set up for that event. So I'll invite you to exit more rapidly than normal after the postlude. For now, as we prepare to go into the rest of this day and to the week to come, may you continue your journey with love. Care for one another, care for this one earth, do justice and make peace. And as you go, whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place of hope, of love, of peace or joy, maybe even a deeper sense of our intradependence, that goes with you into the world. We are different for having spent this time together. We're more deeply entangled. May you live boldly. May you live with thanksgiving.